All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We're starting out with folks muted, but I will unmute you as we get to questions and then allow people to also ask their questions through the chat if you want as well. So be aware that the chat is an option. In fact, I'm going to turn on my chat here. Okay. I'm Janon Saunders. Some of you may be familiar with me as the former Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer. I retired last year, and OHP brought me back on board to help with setting up this new California Maritime Heritage Grants program. And we have Mark Beeson here today, who will be taking over as lead of the program when the applications come in next month. We wanted to set up this webinar because we know this is a brand new program. It's new for us as well as for you guys. So we're all sort of feeling our way through this for the first time and realize that it might be helpful to have a webinar to allow you to ask questions and have a little bit of back and forth that would be easier to do in this format rather than one by one in emails. I've already told you it's a new program, so I'm also going to say be patient with us as we go through this first time working with this new program. We realize that there are sure to be some little kinks along the way, and we'll be refining it as we go forward. You may have noticed, if you paid attention to the dollar amounts that are in the guidelines, that we didn't get a lot of funding this round, especially for preservation projects. Our hope is, though, as if we're successful in this round with our projects, that we'll be getting more funding in the future from the National Park Service. And they do intend to continue offering funding to SHPOs to do subgrant programs like this in the future. So we will continue to apply for them and hopefully have more funding available in future rounds. What else did I want to simply say? For purposes of this webinar, I thought what we would do to sort of organize the questions is go through the different sections of the guidelines document. And when we get to a section that you have a question about something, then you can raise your hand and I'll call on you, or you can put something in the chat to indicate that you are asking a question through the chat. And I guess, Mark, if you could help me kind of keep an eye on the chat as well, and raised hands in case I miss anyone there. I'll also let you know that while I'm looking at you on my laptop, I have a big screen above you that I'm going to be, if I need to pull up documents and refer to them. So if you see me looking up, that's what I'm looking at. Also taking notes for potentially using some of your questions on a frequently asked questions page for our website. So if you see me looking down, I'm probably taking notes so I don't forget anything. And then we may, as I said, we may post this video on our YouTube channel, or I might just use it for refreshing my memory about things I want to put in frequently asked questions. So with that very short introduction, why don't I this is really just intended to be a discussion, a question and answer. So I'll say, does anybody have any questions about the introductory part of the guidelines, the section of the guidelines that talks about sort of general program purpose, program administration, eligible entities, which I know that might be one of the questions that might come up for you all. So anyone who might have questions about the introduction part of the guidelines, either raise your hand and I'll call on you, or you can put something in the chat. And actually, forgive me, we're using Teams for the first time for me for this, so I'll need to familiarize myself for then how to pull up the attendees so I can see who's got any raised hands. There we go, people. Resources and project types, so types of resources and types of projects. And just wondering, does anyone have any questions about that section of the guidelines and the types of resources that can be funded through this grant program, as well as the types of projects? I got a question by email that while I'm waiting to see if there are any raised hands, I'll just bring up that may be pertinent here. And that was someone who said they have a project that involves both preservation and substantial education project. So sort of a project that fits under both of the two categories of grants that we're giving under this program. And the question was, do I need to submit two separate applications if I want to pull from the two sources of funding potentially for my project? And the answer was yes. Those two sources of funding, the $98,500 dollars available for preservation projects and the $242,500 available for education projects are two discrete sources of funding that we can't combine on our end into a single project. So if you do have a project that bridges both, you would need to apply for the preservation money through the preservation projects subgrants program and apply for education money through the education projects subgrant program. And we'd actually have to execute two separate grant agreements in order to then, if you were selected under both programs, in order to pull the funding from both of those funding sources. So if anyone had a question about that, I know it's a little bit clunky and not ideal, but it just has to do with the fact that we have to treat these two sources of funding completely separate. And so that seems like the cleanest way to be able to do that. But be aware that because all the projects have to have some educational component, whether even if they're a preservation project, it might be if your project is really primarily preservation and there's just a little bit of interpretation that you're going to be doing or education of some sort, then that could all fall under a preservation project because you're just doing a small part of it is education or interpretation. It would be the reason we might want two separate applications is if you got a really large interpretation component and a really large preservation project component. And that's where we might want to, you would want to turn in two separate applications. So just keep that in mind depending on the project that you're thinking about and where the funding could potentially come from. Obviously, because there's a lot of funding on the education side, those grants could potentially be a little bit less competitive, and that might be a reason to look at, being able to tap into that funding if you do have a fairly substantial education or interpretation component of your project. Anyone have any questions about that or any questions that have come to mind as a result of my saying that? Right. The next section of the guidelines has to do with the funding amounts, which I've already talked about a little bit, and the payment information, sort of how you receive payment and issues related to funding. Did anyone have any questions about those? I will mention that the part of the reason that we made the funding amounts available for subgrants relatively small on the preservation side is because of the limited amount of preservation money that we have available. So hopefully in future years, if we get larger amounts of preservation funding from the National Park Service, then we can give out larger subgrant amounts as well. But just wanted to explain that that's part of the main reason for the lower levels of subgrant amounts available on the preservation side. Any questions about that issue? All right. Let's see. The next section is kind of a nice catch-all section of the guidelines, sort of general program requirements, things for you to be aware of, both in terms of when you're applying, as well as mostly it's information to be aware of for if you receive a grant, and so that applicants understand going in what the program requirements are going to be related to these particular grants. So just wanted to check and see if anyone had any questions about that. I realize you guys are all probably in the applicant mode, but if there's anything in there that maybe you're considering as an applicant that you would like to know more about. I will go ahead and pull up. I just want to remind myself of what the sections are. Oh, yeah. So the property ownership issue may be something that might come up in relation to your projects. We had initially thought about limiting property ownership to properties that were owned by public entities and nonprofits, but we decided that there may be the potential for other types of property ownership, I should say, or tribal entities that we would want it to open it up a little bit broader. So that is the reason why it could be a privately owned property, but the project proponent, the project applicant needs to be either a public entity, a tribe, or a nonprofit organization. So if anyone kind of noticed that, I just wanted to point out that that was something we considered, but decided to keep the property ownership more open to folks. All right. Um, all right. Excuse me. Moving on. Environmental review is something that is applicable to some of these projects. Depends on the nature of the project and what kind of physical changes are being made by the project. So I wanted to check. I realized that environmental review is only an issue that you will have to deal with if you receive a grant, not at the application stage, but it is good for you to be aware of it at the application stage. So just checking in to see if anybody had any questions about the environmental review aspects. And hopefully the guidelines make it clear that for Section 106 reviews, our office is basically the responsible entity because we're the ones who received the grant, the initial grant funding. So you would not be left on your own to work with the National Park Service on the 106 reviews. That would be something that our office would facilitate and work with you on if you were to receive a grant. For those of you who may be looking at projects that involve National Historic Landmarks, be aware that there's additional reviews for National Historic Landmarks, again, that we would help facilitate and work with NPS on those reviews if an NHL is involved. And on the CEQA side, we would leave that up to you. If you're a public entity, obviously you have your CEQA requirements, or if you're a private entity, it would be between you and the local government with jurisdiction over the project. We would simply be looking for documentation related to that CEQA compliance, but wouldn't be directly working with you on that CEQA compliance, although obviously we can help with any issues that might arise. So any questions on that environmental review piece? The next section of the guidelines is project administration, which is a very obviously a big section and a lot of things to consider when it comes to carrying out your project. Some of it is just good advice. Some of it are actual requirements that your project will need to meet in order to be successful in the grant program. But just want to check in, see if anyone has any questions about those. I'll pull up the guidelines to remind myself of what's in them. It's all pretty basic stuff as I'm looking at it. One thing to be aware of, because I know a lot of grants provide the ability for extensions. In fact, if any of you have received past maritime heritage grants, it was always relatively easy to get them extended. You know, things come up and I need a few more months, I need another year. These grants are very limited in terms of the funding, the time period of the funding that we have available to us. So the limitation that we've put in that all the grant projects have to be completed by the end of February 2027 is a very hard and firm deadline. So that's the reason that the guidelines state very clearly we can't extend them past that date. We are, as the guidelines mention, hoping to get the grant agreements in place by February of 2025 to allow a full 2 years to complete your grants. But just a heads up, especially for folks who may have gotten maritime heritage grants in the past, these are not ones that we are going to be able to extend the time frame on. So as you're thinking about your application, thinking about your project, definitely plan on that 2-year time period being very firm. Oh, I see a chat. All right, hold on, let me switch over there. Is there a minimum stage of design required? No, there is not. There's not a minimum stage of design or concept preliminary required at the time of application, other than you need to have your project fleshed out enough to be able to put together what you consider to be a complete and successful application. So obviously that would vary a lot depending on the nature of the project and what you're planning to do. For example, I think one of the requirements is that, you know, if your project is proposing physical changes to a historical resource, we want to understand how the Secretary of the Interior standards will be followed. So obviously you're going to need to be somewhat, you know, have designed your project to some degree to be able to answer those questions. So look at the application questions, look at the criteria, and consider what you need to do to put together a successful application. How much information about the project do you need to put together a successful application? Let me go back. I don't see any hands raised. Nope. Okay. I'll keep the chat up to see if anything else comes in. Let's see, what else? Let me pull up. Mhm. Oh, one thing I want to mention, I probably doesn't apply to a lot of folks, but just in case it does, it can be a little bit confusing. The section, the project admin section has a section on program income. And just I did want to make it clear because it can be it was very confusing to me. I'll admit it still is a little confusing to me, even though I've really tried to research this issue quite a bit as I was putting together the guidelines. A program income isn't for your entity as a whole. So say you're a museum and obviously you have income coming in and you're carrying out a project. Your general income is not what that section is looking for or what that section is talking about. It's income related to the project. I don't think we've ever actually had a Maritime Heritage Grant project here in California, at least in the last 10 years that I can think of, that generate any program income because you're doing the project. So you're obviously not charging people for access to whatever it is you're working on the project on. So it's very specific to the project, either the resource that the project is involved in or what you're doing with the project in terms of income that would be coming in that would then offset the amount of grant funds that you can take for that project. If I will say this, if you have a very specific question about income at this stage as you're preparing your application, follow up and send us an email to the Maritime Grants email address that's on our website, and we can talk to you specifically. It's a very specific issue, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I just wanted to give you a heads up. I know it's a little confusing, and if it is something that you're worried about in relation to your project and wanting to be able to apply correctly, follow up with us individually. Let's see, did another chat just come in? Oh, no. Okay. Let me see what else is in that section that might be worthwhile to talk about. Payment process. It's all, I think this is pretty, the rest of it's pretty straightforward, hopefully pretty clear. We're looking at twice a year reporting requirements, so semi-annual reporting requirements, and actually that's one of the things I'll be working on before I fully turn over this program back to Mark, is putting together that initial packet that will be going out to grant applicants, and that will include the information about what you'll be required to report. It's not an extremely laborious reporting requirements. It's for those of you who have had past Maritime Heritage Grants, it's the same reporting requirements as Maritime Heritage Grants in the past in terms of the information that's provided to get to us. It's, as you might imagine, it's financial information in terms of what's been spent, what's been encumbered, and basic information about where you are with the project. So it's fairly straightforward. Okay. The next section in the guidelines is about the application and selection process. Any questions about that? I'll just make sure no one's, I think I would see if anyone raised hand. Nope. Okay, I'll go back to chat. Let me pull up the guidelines and see if there's anything that would be worthwhile to mention. Well, as you can see, I'll get into the criteria in a second, but let's talk about the application components. And actually, I did print out the checklist so I could quickly go through the different things that are required. Hopefully it all is fairly straightforward for you. Oh, let's see, hold on, there's a question. I'll go back to that. This is going back to the general section, but we are looking at a Gold Rush era archival and education program with no preservation aspects. Then that would fall, hold on a second, let me, that's where it does get a little bit confusing, I agree. So is that it's a collections, so in that case, the resource is a Maritime Heritage collection. If the project primarily involves doing something with the preserving and making available to the public the Maritime Heritage collection itself, then that's a preservation project. If it's using that collection to create an educational program or an educational or an interpretive program, then that would fall under the education grant. So if you're really just looking, and again, as I was saying, there's a lot more money on the education side. So I would suggest, if you're looking at a Gold Rush era archival and education program, you know, go apply through the education grants if that's the question that you're asking. Yeah, because there is a lot more funding there. And if you're really using those collections to create an educational program or an interpretive program, then that's very clearly an education side grant as opposed to a preservation grant. Even if your project involved a little bit of preservation of of that collection, if the primary aspect of the project is an education program, then that would be an education grant. Can a collection be a restored historic vessel used for education purposes? No, the guidelines, the guidelines clarify, so a collection, a collection can be an object, like a museum collection, something that's in a museum collection. A collection can be a collection of documents, and a collection can be archaeological resources within the context of maritime collections consist of those submerged. There's definitions in the guidelines, but generally a collection is not going to be a resource. It's not going to be a restored historic vessel itself. That's a resource, one of the resource types, but not a collection. Is this an annual grant program? Do you foresee offering these grants again next year at similar funding levels with similar guidelines? Good question. It's not annual in that this program will follow the National Park Service when they free up funds for these subgrant, and then we apply for those funds. So we're actually working from funds that were initially announced in 2022. We received them in 2023, and then we created a program that we're now announcing for 2024. Next year, if the National Park Service announces another round of their grants, we'll apply. We'll likely, hopefully, get those grants and then do another round ourselves. I don't necessarily see it happening annually, so it really just depends on when money is available through the National Park Service, and then when we get the funding, and then when we can put together an announcement and take in applications. So hard to know what the time period will be, but we do see it being a recurring program. Just not sure, might be every other year, might be every 3 years. Just depends on when that funding is available and when we can apply for it and get it. And I don't know what the funding levels will be like. I'll admit to you, this year we asked for a lot more preservation project funding. I believe we requested the maximum amount, which was $500,000 maybe. But National Park Service got a lot of applications, and so then they came back to us and said, we can provide you with a little bit of funding. Sorry, we can't provide you with everything that you've asked for. Can you create a subgrant program for this smaller pot of money? And we said, sure, we'll do what we can. But as I think I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, our hope is that if we're successful with this first round of funding, that gives us more impetus to go back to NPS next time around and say, hey, come on, California really has a lot of amazing maritime resources. We need more funding. I will say also, even though we have a limited pot of money now, if we get a good amount of applications, that gives us more fodder to go back to NPS next time around and say, look, we got all these great applications. We were only able to fund 2 of them because of the money that we had available. If you could give us more, there's a lot of projects waiting out there ready to happen. So I don't want to discourage you from turning in applications because of the small amount of money. Hopefully, getting a lot of applications will help us make the case for getting more money in the future. I do see, you asked about similar guidelines. I'm not sure if the guidelines would necessarily stay the same, especially if we received larger amounts of money. For example, one of the things that we aren't funding this time around is reconstruction projects, just because of the small amount of preservation money available. If we got more, maybe there's that potential for being able to open it up to something like reconstructions. So the guidelines might change based upon funding, or based upon if any changes come down from NPS in future rounds of funding as well. So that could lead to a change in the guidelines as well. You may have noticed also we have a number of bonus point categories for scoring, and I could see those potentially changing as different issues arise that we may want to highlight or focus on in terms of future grants. I see some people are typing, so I thought I'll give it a second to see if more questions pop up. Okay, can you say more about what an ideal project looks like in terms of characteristics, weighting of historical importance versus audience size versus multi-benefit? Ooh, that's a good question and a really tough question. um, if you look at the way that the scoring is set up, and I will say the scoring is, other than the bonus points, the scoring is exactly the same as the National Park Service has used for past maritime heritage grants. Um, but it's, hold on, I'm pulling up the guidelines myself just so I can remind myself of, um, we're looking at both a um, project objectives that point to the importance of the resource. Obviously, as you can see, we ask about describing the need or urgency or threat. Not that a resource has to be threatened in order to get a grant, but those are all issues that will come into play when we look at scoring on your subgrant program objectives. All projects have to have an educational component, so that's one thing I will say. Don't forget that even if you're doing a strict, what you would consider to be a strictly preservation project, you still have to have some type of education component. And as the guidelines point out, that's really commensurate with the type of project. So it might be an interpretive panel, it might be a website, or it might be something more, it might be an actual lesson plan for educators if it's a very large project. But even if it's not an education project, a preservation project, you still have to have some type of educational component. Feasibility is a lot of points because it's really important that we know that you're going to be able to complete this project and within the time frame. So that's something that you will want to spend a good amount of time on. And part of feasibility is also looking at your budget. Is your budget feasible? Does it make sense? Does it really look like this is going to be a successful project? That's also why we're asking about the appropriateness of key personnel, and there's a lot of points there related to making sure that the people who are managing the project, even if you're going to be contracting out, but the folks that on your side, of the applicant side, that are going to be working on the project are going to be able to carry out a successful project, and then making the case for any bonus points. But I would say it's not, I mean, it is the project itself, and it's about the public reach. I mean, obviously, projects that will reach more people or serve more people are likely to have more points. Projects that deal with resources, there are bonus points for resources of statewide or national significance. But again, that's not a requirement, obviously, because those are bonus points. It might be a locally significant resource, and that's fine. So it's really a combination of factors that will go into the overall scoring. But audience size is important, resource type, significance, if it's underrepresented, that's another area for bonus points. So that's, within the overall aspects of the history of California. We'll be looking at, and then again, the feasibility of, is based upon what we're seeing in front of us on the page, is this project likely to be successful? And so that's another aspect that we'll be looking at. One thing I will say is, probably many of you have been on, at some point, the reading end of reading things like these grant applications, and make it easy for the people who are going to be scoring these grant applications. Don't turn in a 500-page document and make them work through it to find the answers to the questions. That's the reason there's a form there, so that you can really make your case on the form. Backup documentation is great, but make your case for why it's a good project, why it's serving a population that needs, a resource type, or a population that really could use this information. Make your case on paper, make it easy for the people who are going to be reading your application to go through and score it, and find the information that they need to do that scoring. Hopefully that kind of answered your question. I will also say, as I said at the beginning, because this is our first time going through this, I'm sure we'll learn a lot as we read through these first set of applications, and we'll be fine tuning both our guidance, our information going forward. Let's see, we got another question. Hello, I'm not sure if this is the right forum for my question. I'm a PhD student at Stanford studying maritime heritage. I love to volunteer my skills and knowledge to get some practical maritime. Oh, okay. I see your question. Yeah. I don't have a good, why don't you, if you would, send an email to the Maritime Heritage Grants email address that's on our website, and we'll follow up with you individually on suggestions for where you might look for that information. One thing while I'm waiting to see if any more questions come in, the forms are a combination. I apologize if they seem a little bit schizophrenic. The forms are a combination. Oh, Adeline, I'll get to you in a second. I just wanted to mention that the forms are a combination of forms that we created for this program, as well as some of the National Park Service's forms that they use for their Maritime Heritage Grant program. So that's the reason some of them might look quite different from others. We pulled them together for this first round thinking, okay, let's see how these forms work for us, and then we'll fine tune them going forward and probably make them all look a little bit more consistent. If you were looking at the forms going, why does this one look so different from this one? It's because we kind of pulled them from various places as we were putting this program together. Because we're relying on funds from the National Park Service and have to meet all of their requirements, it made sense to use some of their forms. And because we're also basically using the same criteria as they use for their program, that's the reason that the project description worksheet, the budget justification worksheet, and the budget information for construction programs form are all from the National Park Services program. Adeline, I saw you put your hand down. If you did want to speak, please go ahead and raise your hand. Oh, and you're there.
Yes, I do have a question. You mentioned that there's not going to be funding for reconstruction at this time.
Mhm.
Our project is the restoration of two iconic buildings in the city of Encinitas that are in the shape of a boat,
Mhm.
and it's considerable restoration. So is that a project that could possibly be funded with this grant, or would I need to wait?
Oh, no, restoration is perfectly, yes, fundable under this program. Reconstruction is if the resource isn't there, or is, you were basically building something up from the ground, or,
Okay.
reconstructing a ship or something. But yeah, that's a complete reconstruction.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Let's see, and then questions about all of the forms, or any questions about the requirement for the easement, which is something that the National Park Service requires. So let's see. I guess I will also mention to you that especially because of the limited amount of funding that we have available on the preservation project side, and because of, I would anticipate a lot of the projects we'll be getting will be preservation projects. I anticipate that we might end up doing what National Park Service did with us, and that is, we see an application that's for a very worthwhile project, but we just don't have the level of funding that is needed. And so we may follow up and say, look, we can't fund your entire project, but can we do a portion of it? What can you do with this amount of funding? So there may be a little bit of back and forth, especially this first round as we go through this, to work with applicants to see what might be doable with potentially less money. I'll say I didn't anticipate the National Park Service coming back to us and stating that, so I was a little bit surprised when they did that. But I can understand why. You get a number of applications, you want to be able to spread that funding around as much as possible, but at the same time have successful projects. Don't be surprised if we end up having to do a little bit of that, working with you to get a number of projects that we think will be successful and that we can fund with the funding available. Let's see, for an education project, can funding be used for basic maintenance during the 2 years of the grant period? Basic maintenance. I don't think that it's disallowed, and I'm looking at some of the information here. But to be to have a good application that's competitive, I think you would want to explain why that funding is needed and what the long-term plan would be for, we wouldn't want to fund something that doesn't look like it's going to be able to be maintained once the grant period ends. So if you're relying on grant funding to do basic maintenance during the grant period, how do we know that that project is going to be continued after the grant period ends? Um, yeah, I don't want to say it can't be done because I believe it's allowable. I'm looking just, yeah, long-term maintenance. Yes. So long-term maintenance beyond the grant period obviously is not allowable, an allowable cost. Maintenance during the grant period is an allowable cost, but I think in your application, you would want to um, explain how you plan to fund maintenance long-term. Say that so that we would know when we're funding the project that once the grant period ends, the project is still going to continue to be available to people. Any other questions? Did I miss any questions? Let's see. I think so. All right. Well, I'm going to stay in this meeting just in case anybody pops in, or if anybody has any questions. But it looks like I don't see anybody typing, and I don't see any raised hands. So thank you so much for coming today. If you do have a follow-up question that comes to mind, we can answer those one-on-one. As I said, I may take some of these questions to create a frequently asked questions page for our website. So thank you so much for those of you who did provide questions. Oh, I do see somebody's typing. So feel free to hang out in case any more questions come up. But oh, I see a thank you. Thank you. Um, thank you guys for bearing with me as we figure this program. And we look forward to seeing your applications. Thank you. We are rebuilding a pier, but in the same alignment. Would that still be considered a reconstruction? Yes. Yeah. Although Mark or Jody, correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, rebuilding a pier, yeah, even in the same alignment, that would be considered a reconstruction. Yes. And maybe you could rebuild the pier using some other source of funding, but then get a grant to do a nice big interpretive or educational project as part of that. That would be nice. Oh, see, you read my mind. Yes, an educational component on the maritime significance of the pier, something you wanted to do in terms of, yes, that would definitely be eligible on the education project side. Thank you. And I will say, I hope we do get more funding in the future to be able to allow for some reconstructions because, especially with maritime resources, they wear out. The sea is a very powerful force, and uh, it would be nice to be able to allow for funding for that in the future. Does an education program have to focus exclusively on the resource? For example, could you explore the history of a specific vessel on a day that you also include maritime biology education on board? That's interesting. That's a very good question. I, hmm, I'm thinking about that. I would say I don't think there's anything in the requirements that said it has to exclusively focus on the resource. Um, Hold on, I'm going to pull up the guidelines so I can just go back to the very beginning. I mean, we're looking at the primary goal of the grant program: assist with and promote the active preservation and use of California's irreplaceable maritime heritage properties. Provide increased opportunities for the general public to visit and learn about historic properties related to maritime history. I, I would say on the face of it, no, it doesn't have to focus. I wouldn't think it has to focus exclusively on the resource. I mean, the whole point of a lot of our maritime resources are to find out other info, or to explore, or to look at things like maritime marine biology. Um, I think, I think you'd want to make the case for why education about marine biology is of value in helping to promote historic preservation of the resources. So linking it to the historic resource and the value of the historic resource. Um, but I would say a short answer is no. But I think you would want to really kind of make the case for why it's an important aspect of the project. Um, because in essence, what you're funding with the grant project may be one thing, and then you may do something else over here, but the grant isn't necessarily funding that other piece of it. Um, uh, and you can talk about what you're going to be using the resource for in terms of other things, but really pointing to this grant is going to be used to do X, Y, or Z. Um, so it considering the fact that these may be fairly competitive grants, I think focusing on the resource as much as possible with the grant funding would be a good idea. But telling us about other things you might be doing with that same resource, obviously that just is helping to promote the resource and use the resource even further. So I think that could only be a good thing. But obviously, you're going to be competing against people who are going to be focusing on the resources. So I think you want your application to focus on the resource and your project to focus on the resource. But if it's also bringing in other aspects of the marine environment and the importance of the marine environment in California history and California today, that that could be useful in terms of actually bumping up your application in a competitive way. Hopefully that answered the question. That's a good question. But yeah, even as I think about it, I think about, a lot of maritime museums. They don't just focus on the history of people. They're also looking at things like marine biology and the other natural resources of our waters. Um, any other questions? All right. I'm I hear my husband talking really loud behind me. Hopefully you guys can't hear him. We've been keeping an eye out. We have some neighbors of ours are keeping cows on our property, and one of them got out of the pasture this morning. So if you see me looking out the window, it's because I've been keeping an eye on our fruit trees, making sure they aren't being eaten by an errant cow. All right. Well, Mark and Jody, you guys are, everyone else is welcome to hang around. I'm going to hang around till 2 just in case anybody pops in. But thank you so much, everybody, for coming today and for your good questions. And if something comes up after this, shoot an email to the Maritime Grants email address, and we'll get that. I check that every day, so we'll get an answer out to you on that. And William, if you wanted to go as well, feel free. Thank you so much. William Berg was here from our office, just helping me since this is my first time using this for a group like this. So thank you, William.
Thank you, Jenna.
Thanks, Mark.